He never saw it coming. While he slept in the safety of his own bed, Dale Harrell's life ended in a storm of blood and betrayal. But the real shock, it wasn't an intruder. It wasn't a stranger. It was his wife. And the lies she told would rival any crime thriller you've ever heard. At first, Marissa Devault claimed it was self-defense. Then she blamed a brain-injured man. But as detectives pulled at the threads of her story, a chilling picture emerged. Secret affairs, staggering debts, and a woman willing to do anything to escape her life. What unfolded in that Arizona courtroom would draw comparisons to Jodi Arias and leave jurors stunned. On the outside, the Harrell Devault household looked like many others in Gilbert, Arizona. A two-story home in a quiet subdivision, a young couple raising 3 daughters, neighbors who waved while driving by. Nothing about the beige stucco house hinted at the violence that would one day make it infamous. Dale Harrell, just 34 years old, was a family man. Friends and coworkers described him as dependable, good-natured, the kind of guy who worked hard and came home to provide for his wife and children. He was the kind of father who made time, even when he was tired, and who saw his daughters as the center of his world. Marissa Devault, in her mid-30s, was seen as the devoted mother and homemaker. To those who didn't know her well, she seemed quiet, unassuming. But behind the smile, cracks had already begun to form. The couple's marriage wasn't perfect. Few are. Arguments about money, stress, and day-to-day struggles were common. But Marissa would later claim something darker. That Dale was abusive, controlling, and cruel. She said she lived in fear. Yet when police dug into their history later, there were no records of domestic violence calls. No restraining orders. No visible trail of abuse. To Dale's friends, the accusations seemed wildly out of character. To investigators, it was the first sign that Marissa's version of events might not align with reality. Still, those were questions for later. In January 2009, all anyone knew was that something unimaginable had happened inside that house. It was the early morning hours of January 14, 2009. While Dale slept soundly in bed, Marissa entered the room with a hammer clutched tightly in her hands. In the quiet stillness, she raised it high above her head. The first blow landed hard against Dale's skull. Then another, and another. The sound of steel striking bone echoed in the dark bedroom. Dale jolted awake, bleeding, confused, fighting to comprehend the agony exploding inside his head. But Marissa didn't stop. By the time it was over, Dale's skull was fractured, his body drenched in blood. Neighbors later described being awakened by screams. Horrific, primal sounds that would haunt them for years. This wasn't a single strike in the heat of fear. This was a calculated, brutal attack. A storm of blows that left Dale clinging to life. Paramedics rushed Dale to the hospital, where doctors fought desperately to save him. He was placed in a medically induced coma, his brain swelling from the trauma. For weeks, his family waited by his bedside, hoping against hope for a miracle. But the injuries were too severe. Dale Harrell never regained consciousness. On February 9, 2009, less than a month after the attack, he succumbed to his wounds. A husband, a father, a son, gone. And the person responsible was not a burglar, not a home invader, but the woman he trusted most in the world, his wife, Marissa. When questioned, Marissa insisted she acted in self-defense. She told officers Dale had attacked her first, and she grabbed the hammer to protect herself. It was a story investigators had heard before, but something about her tone, her timing, and the sheer brutality of the attack didn't sit right. Self-defense meant survival. But the evidence in that bedroom suggested something else. A sleeping man blindsided in the most vulnerable moment of his life. Marissa would later change her story again and again. At one point, she blamed her roommate Stanley Cook, a brain-injured man who lived with the family. The accusation was so outlandish, so cruel, that detectives instantly began questioning everything she said. What they didn't know yet was that her lies were only the beginning. As Dale's loved ones prepared to bury him, detectives prepared for what was quickly shaping into something much larger than a simple domestic violence case. Marissa's life wasn't what it appeared to be. Behind closed doors, she had been keeping secrets. Secrets about money, about affairs, about a man who was bankrolling her lifestyle in exchange for companionship. The truth was darker than anyone could have imagined. And soon, investigators would discover that Marissa Devault wasn't just a grieving widow. She was the architect of a plan that had been in motion long before that fatal night. On January 14th, Dale Harrell lay sleeping in what should have been the safest place in the world, his own bed. But safety is an illusion when the threat comes from within your home. The hammer fell again and again, and as Dale's life ebbed away, Marissa Devault's tangled story began to unfold. A story that would grip Arizona, shock the nation, and leave a jury staring into the eyes of a woman they could never quite understand. Was she a battered wife pushed past her limits? Or a cold-blooded killer with everything to gain? The answer would emerge piece by piece in the days to come. When detectives sat across from Marissa Devault in the interrogation room, they expected fear. They expected remorse. What they got instead was a performance. She described Dale as a violent abuser. She painted herself as a victim pushed to the brink. But as investigators pressed for details, her story shifted. First, she struck Dale in self-defense. Then, in a bizarre twist, she claimed her housemate, Stanley Cook, had attacked Dale instead. Cook was a vulnerable man, living with a brain injury from a previous accident. He was dependent on others, physically and mentally limited. For detectives, the idea that he had committed the brutal hammer attack was absurd. But what chilled them wasn't just the implausibility. It was the cruelty of attempting to pin such a horrific act on someone so defenseless. This wasn't a wife trembling in fear. This was a woman weaving stories, discarding them when they didn't stick, and creating new ones when the truth closed in. The deeper detectives dug, the more they uncovered a web of financial ruin. Dale Harrell had worked hard to provide for his family, but bills stacked higher than his paychecks. Marissa, meanwhile, had been living a double life. Investigators discovered that she owed tens of thousands of dollars in credit card debt. Shopping sprees, bills, secret expenses, all hidden beneath the surface of suburban normalcy. And then came the bombshell, a man named Alan Flores. Flores wasn't a relative. He wasn't a close family friend. He was a wealthy businessman who, for years, had been funneling money into Marissa's hands. Tens of thousands of dollars in cash, gifts, and support. Why? Because Marissa wasn't just a housewife. She was living a secret second life. Alan Flores was more than a financial backer. He was Marissa's lover. Their relationship was transactional but intimate, entangled in deception. Flores testified that he had given Marissa up to $300,000 over time. He believed he was rescuing her from hardship, perhaps even from abuse. But investigators believed differently. They saw a man manipulated, strung along with sob stories, promises, and carefully crafted lies. And what was Marissa's plan? Prosecutors would later argue that Dale's death was a way out, a clean break from a marriage weighed down by debt and tension. With Dale gone, insurance money and continued financial support from Flores could give her the life she craved. To the outside world, Marissa was a mother and wife. But beneath that mask was a woman entangled in greed, infidelity, and a dangerous willingness to do whatever it took to survive. Detectives returned to the crime scene, combing through every corner of the Harrell home. What they found reinforced their suspicions. The blood spatter in the bedroom told a story of an ambush, not self-defense. Dale's wounds showed he had been struck repeatedly as he lay in bed, unconscious, helpless. There were no signs of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no defensive wounds suggesting Dale had fought back. And then there was Marissa's behavior. Instead of grief, officers noted, she seemed calm, even detached. Her focus was not on Dale, still fighting for his life in the hospital, but on her own future. By 2014, after years of delays, the case finally moved to trial. The public braced itself for what promised to be one of Arizona's most sensational courtroom dramas since the Jodi Arias case. The prosecution was ready. They had motive, evidence, and a portrait of a woman whose lies stretched so far they nearly obscured the truth. They argued that Marissa Devault wasn't a battered wife. She was a manipulative killer, hungry for money and freedom. The defense countered with a familiar narrative. Dale Harrell had been an abuser, and Marissa had acted to save herself. They tried to paint her as a desperate woman, trapped in a violent marriage. But one question loomed over everything. If this was truly self-defense, why did the evidence, and Marissa's own words, tell such a different story? Reporters swarmed the courthouse. True crime enthusiasts filled the gallery seats. The parallels to Jodi Arias were impossible to ignore. Both women were accused of savage, bloody murders of men they were romantically involved with. Both claimed self-defense against alleged abuse. Both became lightning rods for public fascination. Their trials broadcast, dissected, and debated across the country. But where Arias was often described as charismatic and manipulative, Marissa's demeanor was different. In court, she was quiet, subdued, often appearing fragile. Yet prosecutors argued that behind that calm exterior was the same calculating drive. 2 Arizona women, 2 sensational trials, 2 stories of love turned lethal. But while Jodi Arias wielded a knife and a gun, Marissa Devault wielded something far more personal, a hammer in the dark of night. Piece by piece, Marissa's lies collapsed under the weight of evidence and testimony. Stanley Cook was cleared. The self-defense narrative crumbled against forensic proof. And Alan Flores, her lover and financial lifeline, turned into the star witness for the prosecution. The jury watched as Marissa's carefully spun image unraveled, exposing a portrait not of a battered wife, but of a woman who saw murder as her escape route. And in the end, it was Dale Harrell, the man silenced forever, whose story resonated most. His friends and family sat in that courtroom, waiting for justice, watching as his killer struggled to explain away the unexplainable. Marissa Devault told many stories, but the evidence told just one. And as her lies unraveled, a chilling truth took center stage. Dale Harrell's death was not an accident of desperation, but a plan years in the making. By 2014, more than 5 years after Dale Harrell's murder, the case finally reached the courtroom. The media was ready. Arizona had seen this before. The spectacle of the Jodi Arias trial was still fresh in the public's memory. But this time, the name on everyone's lips was Marissa Devault. The prosecution wasted no time painting her as cold, manipulative, and greedy. They presented her not as a desperate housewife, but as a woman who had carefully crafted a series of lies to cover her true motives. The defense countered by clinging tightly to the narrative of abuse. They insisted that Marissa was a battered wife who had finally snapped, striking her husband in terror. But the difference between these 2 stories couldn't have been more stark. And the jury would have to decide which version of Marissa Devault was real. One of the most powerful witnesses in the trial wasn't a person at all. It was the forensic evidence. Crime scene experts testified that Dale Harrell had been struck multiple times in the head while lying in bed. The patterns of blood spatter showed a man who had been blindsided, not a man engaged in a violent struggle. A medical examiner walked the jury through the horrifying details. The fractures, the swelling, the sheer brutality of the blows. The hammer had not been used once in desperation. It had been used again and again with force and intent. The science stripped away the stories. It told a narrative of its own. Of a man defenseless, asleep, betrayed by the person he trusted most. The trial's turning point came when Alan Flores, Marissa's secret lover, took the stand. Calm and composed, Flores testified about the money, hundreds of thousands of dollars he had given Marissa over the years. He explained how she told him stories of abuse, financial desperation, and dreams of a new life. But the prosecution pushed further. They highlighted how, just weeks before the murder, Marissa had told Flores she was ready to leave Dale. Not with divorce papers, with something more permanent. Flores admitted that Marissa had once hinted at killing Dale, though at the time, he didn't believe she meant it. The courtroom was silent. Jurors leaned forward. This wasn't just financial support anymore. This was evidence of premeditation. Marissa's attorneys did what they could. They returned again and again to the claim of abuse. They called witnesses to testify about her injuries, about moments of conflict. They tried to cast Dale as controlling, sometimes cruel. But the narrative never fully landed. Without a documented history of abuse, without neighbors or friends corroborating years of violence, the story felt thin. And worse, Marissa herself had destroyed her credibility long before trial. Her false accusations against Stanley Cook, her vulnerable roommate, lingered in the jurors' minds. If she could frame an innocent man once, what else was she capable of? Outside the courthouse, cameras rolled daily. Reporters filled evening broadcasts with every new detail, every twist, every shocking revelation. Commentators couldn't resist the comparison to Jodi Arias. But while Arias had been flamboyant in court, smirking and taunting, Marissa was different. She sat quietly, often avoiding eye contact, sometimes appearing frail, almost ghost-like. Still, the headlines burned with the same intensity. Hammer killer faces justice. Arizona wife accused of murdering for money. The next Jodi Arias? And inside the courtroom, the jury sifted through fact and fiction, trying to discern who Marissa really was. While the legal battle raged, Dale Harrell's family sat silently in the gallery, listening to their loved one's life reduced to testimony and evidence. His daughters, too young to understand at the time of his death, were now growing up in the shadow of tragedy. Friends described Dale as hardworking, kind, someone who didn't deserve to be remembered only as the victim of a gruesome crime. Their grief was a quiet weight in the courtroom, a reminder that behind every headline was a human being, stolen too soon. For the jury, it was about evidence. For the media, it was about spectacle. But for Dale's family, it was about something far simpler: the devastating loss of a father, a son, a brother. As the trial neared its end, both sides sharpened their blades. The prosecution's closing was blistering. Marissa Devault had plotted her husband's murder, executed it with a hammer, and then spun a web of lies so outrageous they nearly obscured the truth. They called her manipulative, greedy, and ruthless. The defense pleaded for mercy. They asked jurors to see Marissa not as a killer but as a woman trapped, battered, and finally pushed past her breaking point. They asked them to see the human being behind the crime scene photos. But the evidence weighed heavy, and the lies, too many, too calculated, seemed impossible to ignore. For weeks, the jury listened. For weeks, they watched Marissa Devault sit silently as her life unraveled piece by piece. And now, their task was simple, yet impossible. Was she a victim, as she claimed? Or was she a cold-blooded killer, as the evidence showed? The answer would come soon, and it would seal Marissa's fate forever. The jury filed into the deliberation room, carrying with them the weight of weeks of testimony, hours of evidence, and a single question that would define the rest of Marissa Devault's life. Was she a battered woman who snapped, or a manipulative murderer who struck for greed? Inside that private chamber, they combed over the hammer, the blood spatter, the lies, the testimony of Alan Flores, and the failed framing of Stanley Cook. Each piece of evidence felt like a shard of glass, sharp, dangerous, and cutting at the truth from a different angle. Outside, the world held its breath. Reporters stood ready. Cameras pointed toward the courthouse doors. Families sat stiffly, waiting for closure or devastation. And Marissa, she sat in her chair, stone still, her face a mask. After days of tense deliberations, the jury returned. The room fell silent as the foreperson stood, verdict slip in hand. The clerk's voice cut the air like a knife. On the charge of first-degree murder, we the jury find the defendant, Marissa Devault, guilty. Gasps erupted in the gallery. Reporters scribbled furiously. Dale Harrell's family clutched each other, tears spilling down their cheeks. For them, it was not justice restored because nothing could bring Dale back, but it was justice delivered. For Marissa, it was the end of the narrative she had tried to spin, the collapse of a world she thought she could control. But the verdict was only the beginning. Arizona was one of the states where the death penalty was still an option. And now, the same jury would have to decide whether Marissa Devault would live or die. Prosecutors pushed hard. They argued that the murder was not only brutal but calculated, carried out for financial gain. They emphasized the deceit, the attempts to mislead police, the betrayal of her children and family. The defense begged for mercy. They highlighted her history of mental illness, her unstable background, her claims of abuse, even if unproven. They painted her as broken, not evil. For days, the jury wrestled with the question of life versus death. It was the heaviest burden imaginable. And in the end, they chose mercy. Marissa Devault was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Even after the sentence, the question lingered: who was the real Marissa Devault? To some, she was a cold-blooded killer, calculating, manipulative, willing to destroy anyone in her path for money and escape. To others, she was a deeply troubled woman, scarred by trauma, desperate for love, trapped in a cycle of lies she couldn't escape from. The truth may have been a twisted blend of both. Psychologists who later studied the case pointed out her ability to fabricate entire narratives at will, switching from victim to villain to survivor in a heartbeat. Her lies weren't sloppy. They were elaborate, multi-layered, tailored for each audience. That kind of deception spoke to something chilling. Not just a crime of passion, but a mind capable of crafting worlds of fiction and living inside them. Even after the trial ended, questions remained. Did Marissa truly endure abuse at Dale's hands? Or was it another invention to justify the crime? Why did Alan Flores continue supporting her, even as her lies grew darker? Was he a victim of manipulation, or a willing accomplice blinded by love? And most hauntingly, did Marissa ever believe her own lies? Or did she always know exactly what she was doing? No one, not the jury, not the psychologists, not even those closest to her, could answer with certainty. What lingered was not just a story of murder, but a story of mystery. The mystery of the human mind, of how far desperation and deception can drive someone. Today, Marissa Devault sits in an Arizona prison, serving her life sentence. The cameras are gone. The headlines have faded. She is no longer compared daily to Jodi Arias, but the shadows of her story remain. In rare interviews, she has maintained her stance as a victim, never fully taking responsibility for the crime. To some, this is proof of her manipulative nature. To others, it is proof of her delusion. Either way, she will never walk free again. In the end, the gavel fell, the lies collapsed, and the woman who once claimed to be a victim of abuse, a desperate mother, a grieving widow, became a convicted murderer. But the mystery of Marissa Devault remains. Was she a woman driven by fear, or by greed, by desperation, or by darkness? Only she knows the truth, and she may never tell. Behind the headlines, Dale Harrell's story was often overshadowed. But those who knew him described a man who was not a monster, but a person, flawed, yes, but trying, working, and living. He was a father of 3 daughters. He had dreams of building a better future for his family, and he had trusted the woman who shared his home, never imagining that the one he loved most would bring about his end. At his funeral, friends and family remembered his laughter, his loyalty, his efforts to provide. They remembered the way he teased his daughters, the way he worked late hours to keep food on the table. For them, Dale was not a headline. He was a human being. And the real tragedy of Marissa Devault's crime wasn't just the horror of the murder. It was the silence it left behind in the lives of those who loved him. As the dust settled on the trial, investigators and prosecutors reflected on what the case revealed. Marissa Devault had shown them how far manipulation could stretch. Her web of lies entangled not only strangers but also friends, lovers, and even the justice system itself. She had nearly convinced detectives that a brain-damaged man had killed Dale. She had swayed Alan Flores to bankroll her defense, even as she faced a capital murder charge. She had convinced multiple men over years that she was someone she wasn't. It was a chilling lesson. Sometimes the most dangerous weapon isn't a hammer, it's deception. Marissa's case also reignited conversations about domestic violence, both real and fabricated. Advocates for victims of abuse worried that women like Marissa could make it harder for real survivors to be believed. By weaving abuse into her defense without evidence, She risked undermining the credibility of countless women who truly lived in fear of their partners. Others argued that Marissa's story revealed society's blind spots, the ways in which people are quick to believe a narrative of victimhood, even when the facts don't line up. Either way, her trial left more than just a legal precedent. It left a cultural scar. In prison, Marissa Devault faded from headlines. She no longer made national news, no longer stood in front of cameras. She became another inmate, serving a life sentence in the Arizona Department of Corrections. Her daughters grew up without their father, without their mother, without the life they had once known. For them, the echoes of that hammer strike never ended. They carried forward scars that would never fully heal, the scars of betrayal, of abandonment, of becoming collateral damage in a story they never asked to be part of. And still, the mystery lingers. Why did Marissa Devault truly kill Dale Harrell? Was it purely financial desperation, as prosecutors argued? Or was it something darker, something in her psyche that drove her to destroy the man beside her? Did she ever feel guilt in the quiet hours of the night, behind the bars of her cell? Or did she, as some psychologists believe, convince herself of her own lies until they became truth? We may never know, because Marissa Devault, like Jodi Arias before her, has become more than just a criminal. She has become a riddle, one wrapped in blood and betrayal. A hammer in the night, a husband who never woke up, a wife whose lies unraveled before the world. This was not a crime of passion. It was a crime of deception. In the end, the jury saw through the stories, the manipulations, the performances, and Marissa Devault was left with nothing but the truth and a life behind bars. In loving memory of Dale Harrell, may his soul keep resting. If this story was helpful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more.